Hello, friends, and thanks for joining me again. I want to talk about the steam locomotive that I recently purchased. For many years, I've wanted to dabble into the larger scales of steam locomotives, beyond the G and F scale locomotives that I own. I've had my name out for a long time, and basically have said, if anyone knows someone getting rid of a locomotive, please let me know. Here in Danvers, where I live, we have such a rich history of the live steam hobby. Basically, though not founded here, a large portion of the early years were here in Danvers, about a half a mile from my house. In this photo, actually, is Richard Sims, a early and long-time live steam pioneer. He had emailed me and said, there's a locomotive available, and with his connection, I was able to secure the deal, and here is Richard looking over the locomotive. Once the locomotive was home, I began to do an inspection of it, basically to see where I was mechanically as well as aesthetically with the engine. Also included in the sale were the 2 riding cars that you see behind it. I was assured that this locomotive had been running within the last couple of years. Overall, it is a LBSC Juliet model, which is an 040 configuration starter locomotive, which is perfect for a beginner like me, and it is light enough that you can move it around yourself. You don't need a crew of people. Taking a look at the back head, I noticed that the gauge is incorrect and was always hovering around 20 psi, so I arranged for a replacement gauge. Everything else seemed to be in good order in the back. I opened up the smoke box and found a pile of clinker. This is about half of it removed. I got the vacuum cleaner out for the rest of it. I wanted to do an inspection of the flues and see where I was at. Once I got the smoke box cleaned out, I ran a brush down the flues and found no obstructions. I also took off the tops of the water tanks to take a look inside and also check the water pump condition, and loosened up some stuck buffers. The other thing that was starting to bother me deeply, and I don't know why, was the ugly light green paint looking like you know who. Also notably missing from the locomotive was an ash pan and firebox grate. The previous owner states he did not have one. The locomotive was built by an unknown builder in Canada, and the previous owner could not really provide me a great history on this engine. So, taking a look at the firebox from underneath, I decided that it was time to contact my buddy Gordy and go down to his workshop. I had read on many forums that instead of using cast iron grates, a lot of people had switched over to using 1/4-inch plate steel, providing a much more durable grate. So off to Gordy's workshop we went to do some figuring and some fabrication. Gordy has about every tool imaginable, so this was a fairly quick process, and we were able to grind this to shape and drill it out. The initial hole pattern was a 1/8-inch hole followed by a 3/16 hole, but after this was fabricated and run a few times, I actually just drilled out everything to 3/16 of an inch. We did a test firing in the driveway and basically discovered that we have a lot to learn about running a coal-fired locomotive. Another observation we made that night was the wheels did not want to rotate freely. We figured it was due to old grungy oil in the pistons, so we took it to Andy's track to free it up by running it back and forth by hand. Once we were able to do that, we considered firing it up, and then Andy said, well, I got a locomotive I want to see if I can get running, and we spent the rest of that day getting Andy's engine up and running, and then I ran out of time and got totally distracted and had to go home. Once back on the workbench, I took off the gauge and began to measure it to find a replacement. Through R services in New Jersey, I was able to find one in the United Kingdom that had to be made. If you are planning on a replacement gauge of this size, in this style, plan on it being a while coming from the United Kingdom. Also, while on the bench, I decided to fabricate a new ash pan. I used a piece of 20 gauge sheet metal, and over to the metal cutting bandsaw I went with a pattern drawn out, basically from conjecture and speculation on how I think an ash pan should look. I could not find any real blueprints of an ash pan, so I did the best I could, and actually I did a pretty good job. I also fabricated this 1/8" grate rod to hold in the fire grate and ash pan. I also took another piece of that rod and took it over to the torch and squared off one of the ends. And in doing this, I made a little fire poker to break up the clinker, as well as get behind the lip of the firebox door to pull it open without scalding your hand. Staring at the locomotive on the bench, I just could not get over the paint. It was starting to bother me. So a proper coat of black paint for the boiler was in order. I also decided to polish the brass of the steam dome and other brasses on the engine in the true proper Victorian style. I think Brunel himself would be happy. I then applied a proper coat of dark green paint and red trim to the windows, as well as a black cab roof. It really makes the builder's plate that says Juliet stand out. I wanted a place to display this engine, so I took a few pieces of LGB rail and an oak board and rubbed it down with oil for a display stand. This sits in my train room, and the locomotive looks nice sitting on the table. And here's a before and after of the paint job. I also ordered a draft fan from AccuCraft that came in on the mail. I decided to do a test firing to test out this fan to see if it had enough CFM, and it seemed to work okay. But during that test firing, I noticed that my gauge has a steam leak. So this gauge is definitely junk, and a good thing I ordered another one. And here's a nice shot of the firebox. It actually got going pretty well. Turning my attention while waiting for the gauge to the riding car, I have two cars that came with this engine. One was originally built by Dick Sims way back in the 60s, and this car was a more modern one built by the previous owner. Having no historical affection for it, I decided to convert this to a car to ride a ground-based layout like the one I would build. I added a seat back and a cushion, and it seemed okay, but it was a little bit awkward, especially for a bigger guy like me to get on and off. So I decided I had to add a foot peg to rest your sneakers against, and also a seat box, basically to lift up the seat a few inches. And even though it's only 3.5 inches, that height difference makes all the difference in the world when you're getting on and off this car sitting on the ground. Looking for track, I had a hard time finding proper rail. I was able to find through old advertisements a company called Culp Rail in Pennsylvania. And through a long phone tree, I found out that the business was no longer in business under the original owner, but was sold to a couple guys in Rhode Island. And being in Rhode Island, it was somewhat of a no-brainer to choose this 5/8 scale rail, because it was only about an hour and a half from my house, which eliminated all the issues with shipping, especially awkward lengths of 10-foot rail. For ties, I'm using what I have on hand. As always, cost is a consideration, and much like the narrow gauge railroads of Maine, I'm just using what I have on hand to get going. And I had a lot of this 1x2 pine batten stock sitting from my shed project. I know it's not ideal, and before people go herpa-derpa-derpa, you're using pine and it's untreated. I do intend to treat this with an oil. I fabricated a track jig and began assembling my first panel of track. I'm using Tex number 8 Phillips head screws that are used for lath. They're lath head screws. So they have a wider flange at the top. They seem to work well. They're 3/4 inch and they don't split the wood. My first panel assembled, I actually had an offset built in case I ever wanted to do a 5-inch gauge railroad. But I quickly realized that I probably never will. And if I did, I would need more substantial ties anyway. So this first panel has the offset to accommodate that. And I got on the car and I tested out the stability, and it was actually quite stable. I went back and readjusted my track jig and made it so that the ties, or the rail, is centered on the ties. And it's just going to be a 3.5-inch gauge. And using 7.5-inch ties for the 3.5-inch gauge, I think gives a proper visual appeal to the track, as well as good stability combined with economy of materials. And if you notice, I use 3 screws per side. This is to prevent when you pick this up, the rails racking back and forth and you get improper gauge.
All aboard.
I used my daughter as a test bed to see if how the car would ride and how it would roll on this track. And it actually worked out very, very well. With all this new track laying around, I decided that I simply must start planning the railroad and began to lay out the panels in different areas. I'm going to go more into the track building in my next episode, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what I'm doing here. My goal is to build a point-to-point railroad back and forth, and to basically a place to use my steam engine, but I'm not going to encircle my house due to the size of my yard and land constrictions, and basically also cost. You know, I'd like to do an elevated railroad, like more traditional lines, but everything else in the world, you have to consider budget as a #1 priority when you plan this stuff. And outside of New England, I don't really see a lot of elevated lines that people ride on. So this will do fine for me. I'm only doing about 110 feet back and forth. So I'm going to go into more on the track building, excavation, and layout in the next episode. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I hope you found this useful.